All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to ask everyone to quiet down so we can get started again. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. Now we're going to begin our focus on Sustainable Development Goals and their role in driving risk-adjusted returns. The panel discussion will be led by our own Managing Investment Director of Sustainable Investments, Beth Richtman, and I'll let Beth introduce your panel. Over to you, Beth.
Thank you, Priya. Ms. Mather. Good afternoon. I'm Beth Richtman, the Managing Investment Director of the Sustainable Investments Program. So this afternoon, we will be focusing on several sustainable investment topics, starting with the Sustainable Development Goals. Back in January, at the board offsite, it featured a session which was an introductory and educational session on the Sustainable Development Goals, as established by the United Nations in 2015. Today, we'll be revisiting the Sustainable Development Goals, which are often referred to as the SDGs. Now, the SDGs were not established as an investment framework, but many institutional investors around the world are now looking to them to try to figure out how they should inform and in some cases frame their sustainable investment efforts. And I will note that ever entrepreneurial asset managers and service providers have taken note and have begun marketing lots of SDG products to investors such as CalPERS. So the goal with this session today is to provide a useful and informative discussion of what it means to look at the SDGs as an investor trying to achieve financial returns. This discussion and the board's feedback will help the investment office decide how we should look at the SDGs. Some people think of the SDGs as the world's strategy or the world's playbook. And I would think that at the very least, an investor such as CalPERS would want to understand the world's playbook in terms of using it to signal, where we could look for risks and opportunities in the global market. But what I'm not yet sure about is how we should look at the SDGs beyond just looking at them as a guidepost for where to look for risks and opportunities in the global market. Are the SDGs something that CalPERS wants to focus on in whole or in part for our sustainable investment efforts? Do we want to measure ourselves by impact against the SDGs or some other impact standards or by our returns alone? Can and should we do both? One thing you'll hear later today from me in my presentation on the vision for the Sustainable Investment Program is that our goal is to focus on the topics which have the highest potential monetary value to our beneficiaries. And I look forward to the discussion on how you think the SDGs could inform that focus. At the last offsite in January, the board gave direction to the investment office to map the SDGs relative to our strategic plan. The team has mapped the SDGs to our strategic plan, our ESG strategic plan, our investment beliefs, and also the updated governance and sustainability principles that the board approved in June. The mapping is included in your board book. A few things I'd like to mention about this mapping exercise. One, we approached the mapping at a high level, looking for overlaps and connections between our policies and the strategic plan and the SDGs. And at a high principle level, there is a lot of general overlap between our existing policies and strategic plan and the Sustainable Development Goals. The overlaps, though, were typically to parts or a part of the SDGs rather than an entire SDG. And also, I should mention that the SDG targets and indicators tend to be more specific and time-bound than our policies and investment beliefs. I will also note that we did not map our investments to the SDGs. To do so comprehensively would be a formidable challenge given the size and the numerous, holdings and complexity of our portfolio. That said, within our portfolio, there are certainly companies that are contributing toward Sustainable Development Goals. And inevitably, there are some companies that may present setbacks for some of the SDGs. It's a complex thing to look at as an investor. I look forward to any questions you have about the mapping over the course of this agenda item. And I hope that this mapping will be helpful to the board as you think through how you would like the investment office to strategically and practically approach the SDGs. The upcoming panel discussion should be quite informative. We have 3 investors here, all with different perspectives and different approaches to the SDGs. Their bios are included in your board book. We have Scott Mather from PIMCO, Andrew Perry from Hermes, and Maya Korangal from TPG's The Rise Fund. Each of the speakers represents a different style of investing. We're separately covering publicly traded stocks, fixed income, and private equity. The panel presentation will be divided into 3 parts. In part 1, each panelist will give a presentation, mainly covering how they have approached the SDGs as an investor looking to achieve financial returns. And in part 2, I will serve as a moderator, asking a set of 6 questions that I shared with the panelists in advance. In part 3, we will have about 45 minutes for the board to ask any questions you would like. Our plan is to take all the feedback and discussion and insights we get from today's panel, and then to come back in March with thoughts on how we could update our strategic plan, related to the SDGs and the feedback we receive. So our first panelist is Scott Mather. Scott is the Chief Investment Officer of PIMCO's U.S. Core Strategies. He's a member of their investment committee and a managing director in their Newport Beach office. He oversees PIMCO's ESG integration in their U.S. portfolio. Now to Scott.
Yeah, so I thought I have a few slides here to sort of introduce our approach to sustainability issues, how we think about it, and then also how we think about SDGs within that context. I think we've always felt as sort of fundamental fixed income investors that sustainability issues are really complementary to a proper analysis, particularly over a medium and long term. And we would say that's even more true today, because we observe that both the pace of environmental change, social change is accelerated, meaning that there are more risks and opportunities for investors that are particularly related to environmental and social factors, as well as the traditional governance factors that most people recognize are really important to determining investment performance over a medium and long term. So we've redoubled our efforts to incorporate more E, S, and G analysis into everything that we invest in. And we've taken the approach to say that it should be fully integrated. It's not something that's separate from our traditional investment analysis. We've expanded the template of research that we do and everything that we invest in with respect to E, S, and G issues. We've long believed in doing our own research in the area. We love reading everyone else's research. We love having access to external data providers. But on these topics, just like with our traditional investment analysis, we think it's important that we do our own research because, to be frank, there's not necessarily a consistent set of data that's out there that's simple for investors to rely on. There probably eventually will be, but there's not today. There's a lot of data providers out there. There's different types of disclosures coming from different companies. But it's accelerating. There's a lot more available. It's important that we make use of that, but we've also believed that it's important to do the analysis internally. And so our framework is really built around these principles. It's exclusions, which I would say are certain industries and certain companies within certain industries that we think are particularly risky, either because of their lack of preparation for any sort of change with respect to ESG factors. They're not addressing some risk that we think could damage the business over the medium term. Or there's great opportunities that they're not seeking, and therefore they have a particularly low ESG type of score. So part of the process is built around excluding those companies from those portfolios. And the other part is based on an evaluation, and I'll get into more detail on that in a minute, but basically trying to identify the companies that are leaders, those issuers that not only have a good sense of where they are today, but are thinking about the possibilities of how things may look out 2, 3, 5 years from now. We believe firmly that companies that have a well thought out process to think about sustainability issues, those are the better strategic thinkers, the better strategic risk takers. So even if you didn't have any particular concerns about an environmental, a social, or a governance issue with a particular company, we think it's still the case that companies that are thinking about those issues and possibilities are also the ones that are probably going to be better at managing their business, and therefore better investments over a medium and long term. So you don't even have to get so narrow to focus on a particular ES&G topic just to realize that those companies that are leading and doing better with respect to thinking about these issues are also just better managed companies and likely to be better investments as a result. The third pillar is engagement. Now, sometimes people don't realize that as fixed income investors, we can probably have a pretty big impact on company behavior, but certainly we can as a large asset manager, someone who typically, we have thousands of meetings with the companies we invest in around the world every year. And fixed income is sort of unique. It's been maybe ignored for too long in terms of people thinking about sustainability issues, but there's something unique about bonds that's different than equities. And that's that most bond issuers, they have to come back to market every single year or multiple times a year. So there's automatic points when investors have some leverage about asking a company about their plans, their behavior. And companies increasingly care because they recognize that the ratings that they have, the traditional ratings that they have, are put at risk if they don't address investors' concerns about sustainability issues. So we have sort of a natural leverage that maybe other fixed income investors, haven't traditionally thought that they've had, but they do have it because of these companies continually returning to market and constantly needing a validation, not just by the people that buy their bonds, but also by rating agencies, external data providers. So it's our mission to engage with companies. Our view there is if we can find companies that might only be average performers and show them the path on what their competitors are doing to address sustainability issues and what they could be doing, that we and our investors will benefit, not just because they're having a positive social impact, but because financially, you're probably going to be in a better spot if you get companies moving faster with respect to addressing risks and opportunities that come from the changing environment and sustainability issues that are out there. So this is just a bit more about how we go about that in terms of what we're doing when it comes to scoring our investments. We think about it as each industry, we have different weights and different scores because there's a different relevance factor. It's not for different industries. Sometimes it's the environment that's more important in determining their success or the riskiness of their business. For others, it's more governance. For others, it's more particular social issues. And so we score them relative to their peer group. And importantly, we're making an analysis about whether they're stable, improving, or headed the wrong direction. And we feel pretty strongly you want to avoid the ones that are headed the wrong direction relative to the peer group. And so it's important to have a sense not just where they are today, but where they're going. And as investors, we believe that's how you really get the benefit in a dollars and cents perspective, by identifying companies that are constantly looking to reduce their risk, think about the medium term, address those risks, and address the opportunities. And those are going to be the companies that are going to have a better trend with it when it comes to ESG factors. So that's an important part of our analysis. And let me just talk a little bit here about how we think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And here, and it's often called the gift to investors. That's the way the UN would like to frame it, and we agree. Because think about the Sustainable Development Goals as a universal global language, okay, that governments, policymakers, agencies around the world are speaking. And it helps put numbers, key performance metrics that you can track and that you can ask companies and issuers to track and say, well, how are you contributing to this particular goal? So, sometimes ESG flies at such a high level, it's difficult to get the quantifiable, measurable achievements. And the SDGs are different because all 193 member states of the UN not only agreed to support this SDG framework through 2030, so this is with us for every year up until 2030 at least, but they also agreed on 169 key performance metrics that back up each one of the 17 goals. So when you pull back the cover, and I would encourage you, if you have interest, to look at the UN's, look at some of these documents. They publish an annual performance review that says, well, here's how we're doing, with respect to those 169 key performance indicators, and they all align with one of the 17 goals. We think that's just a very helpful framework to track progress, to make it quantifiable, and to get governments, agencies, and corporations thinking about how do they analyze their business within the context of those goals that every country has agreed those are the most important things. It's not to say it's all-encompassing. I mean, there's lots of things that are obviously not in there, but it's the agreement amongst nations about what is most important. So that's how we think sustainable development goals are particularly important for investors. And increasingly, we did a survey of companies that we invest in, asking them, through our engagement process, which sustainable development goals are important to you, how many companies are thinking about reporting in terms of, looking at their business in terms of saying, well, here's annually how we're doing with respect to these sustainable development goals. We're only 2 years into this process, right? Because they started in 2015. But it's surprising, this chart on the left shows you how many of those companies that we surveyed said, yes, we are looking at sustainable development goals and thinking about our business, our revenue, our profits, the balance sheet in those terms. And you can see by the different action points on the left, all 17 are listed there. So obviously there's some that are more a focus of companies than others, but it's interesting how high that number is already. So, companies are already thinking about this. We think that's just going to grow exponentially over time. It's a good thing. There'll be more disclosure. It'll become easier for us as investors to analyze industries and companies with respect to sustainability issues, and specifically SDGs, because those numbers are going to keep growing pretty substantially. And we've been encouraging through industry groups, through our own engagement, we've been encouraging companies to think about reporting in terms of SDGs, maybe not their whole business, but certainly looking at pieces of their business and saying, well, this is what we're doing to address this particular issue. We're going to tell you what we're going to do. We're going to give you progress year by year. We're going to address risks and opportunities and think about it in that space. Some companies go so far as to map their revenues, where their goal, there's several multinational companies doing this, to say they're going to take all their revenues and sort of attribute them to where they align on a sustainable development goal. And that is a pretty interesting direction to go. And of course, we think there'll be standards that develop over time, but right now we're just not quite there yet. And then you can see on specific industries that the chart on the right is just interesting. Here we just looked at the difference between banking and utilities as two different industry sectors in terms of their survey response. The only point is here to say, the sustainability issues are different by different industries. And I think we all have to recognize, too, that they're going to change pretty substantially. Today, we don't know what the issues will be 5 years from now necessarily. We have a general idea, but they'll change a lot. And you see that play out in today's news events and things that really impact performance day by day. Think about Dieselgate, right? Wasn't really a factor until everyone discovered there's major automotive companies cheating on diesel tests, and it became a big issue over the course of a couple months. So it appeared sort of out of nowhere. Think about the financial industry. Yes, there's the legacy financial crisis issues, but then think about the more recent issues that have crept up with companies like Wells Fargo. So all of a sudden, there's something new that's very, very much relevant and very much immediate with respect to investment performance that has all to do with sustainability issues. So it's just to say, we believe this is something it should be an important part of the investment process. It's ongoing. You can't know it all today. What's going to be relevant tomorrow. It's always something that it's part of the diligence effort that you need to continually devote resources to and to continue to keep researching. But we think it's completely complementary to, I guess, traditional investment analysis, and we would go so far as to say it's really inseparable. If you're going to do a good job investing over the medium and long term, we think you increasingly have to pay attention to these sustainability issues to get the best return per unit of risk. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Okay, our next speaker is Andrew Perry. Andrew is the head of sustainable investing at Hermes Investment Management. He's a member of the Hermes Strategy Group and also co-chair of the UNEP FI Positive Impact Steering Committee, and a member of the Investment Committee of the Trafalgar House of Pension Trust. Turning over to you, Eric.
Thank you. It's very good to be here and to talk about a subject that's been actually occupying most of my year. If you actually judge the interest in sustainability by the amount of air miles I've accrued, it's going exponential. And of course, we do full carbon offset as well. It's a topic that I'm passionate about. It's a topic that we've been passionate about at Hermes for nearly 40 years. We've really, we view it in a sort of holistic sense, and we're not looking just at the narrow financial, but seeing the financial in the context of the wider impact on society and the environment. In your talk before lunch, you talked a little bit about the technology transfer that's going on, the change. I think we are in a world of transitions in globalization, in demographics, in climate and technology. And they're all interlinked because it's a complex system. If you think about what's been going on in the climate, or about in Europe. Europe's a great example. You think about Europe and the immigration crisis that we've been having in parts of Europe. A lot of people coming from Syria, which you think is all about a civil war. In the run-up to the civil war in Syria, there was an 8-year drought which saw an 80% collapse in agricultural output in northern Syria. No wonder people wanted to leave. But it was also ripe for civil insurrection, for insurgents in environments like that. So these things are really very complex, and they're a part of our daily lives. It's very easy to sometimes think of these things as abstracts in the future. Many people portray these changes as well as sources of risk, even sources of fear, because they do bring incredible uncertainty. But also many of them bring, as you heard earlier, great opportunities. And I think we do have to look at the world in a way that we should be optimists. I think it's first and foremost our imperative as investors, whether it be asset owners like CalPERS or asset managers, such as the people here on the table, that we have to see sustainability as a way of just being better at our jobs, improving the long-term returns and managing better the risks in our client portfolios and managing them in the interests of our beneficiaries. Already, climate is having a significant impact on our world. This chart, which I borrowed from the New York Times, you read it from the bottom right up, and what these hemispheres show is that the size, frequency, and cost of weather-related natural disasters in America is increasing and has been increasing steadily since 1980. These are real events. If your house gets flooded once, you can view it as a 1 in 100-year event. If it gets flooded twice in 10 years, then your insurance premiums go up. If it gets flooded 3 times in 10 years, you can't get it insured and you can't sell it. That's happened to people who live near me in the picturesque part of Oxfordshire on the banks of the Thames. These things are very real and they begin to have an impact on many people's lives. Very much we live in an interconnected system. I think sometimes in our world of finance, we can very easily live in our own bubble and think of finance as a world on its own. I think it was a mistake that Alan Greenspan made in the run-up to 2008, seeing the financial system disconnected from the rest of the world. But very much the capital markets, our investment decisions, as Scott mentioned earlier, are very embedded into the broader ecosystem. And what we're really trying to achieve is a system-level change, where we have to have a long-term vision that creating more equality, fairness, and more sustainability in our system is actually good for our financial returns. And sometimes we confuse short-term with long-term value creation. And it's very much, I see the sustainability agenda as about improving your long-term rates of return and actually creating greater resilience in the system. People shouldn't forget that the difference between 2 degrees and 3 degrees of warming isn't sort of hotter summer days, but is actually economically catastrophic that would have a major damaging impact on the retirement income of your beneficiaries. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals have become very popular. They're ambitious, they're very complex, they're very detailed. There are 169 targets, 230 key performance indicators, and they're also universal. So unlike their predecessors, the Millennial Goals, they are designed to be applicable to all parts of the world. The Millennial Goals were very much focused on the developing world, where indeed the SDGs still have the most pressing needs, but they are also relevant to the community around you. There's social housing, financial exclusion of many workers, of gender equality and racial equality issues still that we have in the developing world. So they can be seen as a way of identifying underserved, unmet needs in all parts of the economy. I think it was mentioned as well that they were never designed to be financial tools. In fact, when the UN came up with them, they deliberately excluded the financial sector. Actually, you think they were being created in around about 2010, and we were all in the dog box then. That was just after the financial crisis, and I don't think the UN thought that the financial system really had a role to play. But of course we do, because we are the delivery mechanism for actually financing many of these things. And one thing I would say about the goals is the critical word in there is actually the third word, goals. These are about aspirations of something that's going to be achieved in the future, not for something that we're doing today. So they really are a very call for action and a mobilization of future capital, not about remapping existing activities. And where do I get my optimism? Well, it's $93 trillion is the cost. Half of that is incremental, i.e. new capital. So if you're a stock picker, you see that as a huge opportunity. You see that as an opportunity to find exciting emerging growth companies. Already the electric vehicle phenomenon is outstripping all the forecasts of the energy companies. Installed wind energy every year for 20 years has beaten the IEA's forecast for how much is going to be installed. So these are exciting emerging growth opportunities. That's what the themes in orange show, that the size of the opportunity is really exciting if you're an investor, whether it be in credit, public equities, or private markets. So we shouldn't see them as an unnecessary cost burden on society. You can see them as a great way of, frankly, making money. We look at the world in these four quadrants, really. We see the opportunities based around sort of mega trends. These are the long-term structural growth opportunities that the SDGs represent. We see the emerging growth opportunities at the individual company level, things like precision agriculture. The Netherlands, next after the United States, is the second largest net exporter of food in the world. The landmass of the Netherlands is smaller than your smallest state. So it's an extraordinary achievement, but that's precision agriculture, agroponics, hydroponics, and things like that. But also there is a risk element to it. There's the systemic risks around demographics and climate change. We see these as a stranded assets concept. And we also see around this, the operational risk, which is more the stranded business models, as companies get left behind by the transitions that I mentioned earlier and don't recognize the world is moving. I think we have to also be honest that there are pitfalls with the SDGs. They are very pictorially attractive. My industry is adopting them at pace. And so we have to avoid that, the problem of people just using them as convenient marketing labels. The UN is now actually saying you can't use these to sell products. And I think it's very important that we do recognize that these are forward-looking. They are measures, they are objectives for measuring your success at achieving something in the future, not something that you're doing now. So that's why there's a theory of change behind it, because it is about changing the world and mobilizing fresh capital. And it is really about that. We say and agree with Scott that engagement is a very important part of the process. Engagement in the debate, but engagement with companies to actually change their behaviors to deliver better outcomes. This rather complex chart is another one of the projects I work on. This is taken from the Impact Management Project, which is a collaboration of 700 different investors around the world, from NGOs, foundations, private equity, credit, public markets, etc., for thinking about the different dimensions of impact and actually how we can begin to think about integrating SDGs in an impactful way of investing. You know, it's very important when investing to think about the what, the how much, the who, and the contribution and the risk associated with your investment. So it gives you, those are the 5 dimensions of impact. And then the different ways that companies are approaching it. There are still companies who just don't consider it. So it's great that many are thinking about it, but still far too many are not thinking about their impacts. And they shouldn't just think about their positive impacts. And that's the problem with the corporate sector, is they'll often focus on the positives and ignore the negatives. Because what we're trying to achieve is a more resilient system, and the only way to do that is to eliminate or minimize negatives and reinforce positives. So that's why I keep talking about relabeling existing activities. But this is a great framework. It's increasingly being adopted across the industry. And I think it's about having a framework for doing your job and understanding the opportunities. We've been busily integrating ESG for 30-odd years at Hermes. We are a leader in engagement in many ways. So we do really think that engagement is important, not just about how you engage with companies, but how you do public policy advocacy, because it's the total system, and how you provide education. You do need to educate. We have strategies based around that, where we use engagement at the corporate level to change behaviors aligned to delivering specific SDG targets. And we also invest in impact, in impactful companies providing products and services designed to meet the SDGs, as well as reinforcing that with good ESG practice, even in real estate. I did mention that it should first and foremost about being better investors, and in many ways I see ESG and sustainable investing as just basic good finance. Who doesn't want to invest in companies that are efficiently managing their energy, their water, who are minimizing the amount of waste that they use, because that's good margins? That you want companies treating their workers well so they have low staff turnover, low absenteeism, low strike rate, and low death and injury rates, because that's good productivity. Volkswagen was mentioned earlier, just showing you why good governance matters, because it can destroy your value. So there's a lot of empirical evidence that both investing sustainability and actual active engagement both add to long-term returns. And this is a long-term business. This is not about short-term returns. So we use the SDGs as a way of identifying structural growth themes. These are the ones that we use. We take a very thematic approach, and we use the SDGs as our taxonomy for identifying these, and I can talk a bit more about that, hopefully, in the panel session. But it's a great way of identifying future opportunities, whereas the index represents yesterday's growth story. As a stock picker, I'm interested in what's going to happen tomorrow and in the future. I think very much investing through an SDG lens is about a context-based approach. It's not about being prescriptive. I see there are 4 pillars. I've added one more than Scott. I very much see that these 4 pillars allow you, for each organization, to find the right way of integrating the SDG that meets their needs, their requirements, and their resources. So it can be around growth, identifying the emerging growth opportunities, around risk, avoiding stranded assets and stranded business models, advocacy, so that's how you engage and vote with companies, but how you engage publicly and how you educate people, both your staff, your employees, and your beneficiaries. And then reporting. I think reporting is very important, transparent, open and honest, to disclose both the positives and negatives. And we must avoid just thinking of SDGs as positives. There are negatives. In many ways, we all are impact investors. And I said it was a complex subject. And we shouldn't just think of this as a route for the financial service industry to sell you more product. We have to find products that are aligned to the delivery of the SDGs, but we all have a role to play in our personal lives, in the way that we consume, in the way that we actually manage our own personal resources, what we do as organizations, what we do as, with the companies in which we invest, and the governments and the regulators as well have a role to play. And very much I see it as about improving our Sharpe ratio, i.e. managing our return opportunities better and managing down our risks. And without thinking about the risks and opportunities the SDGs represent in a forward-looking way, we'll miss that opportunity. So very much, I'm excited by the SDGs as an investor. I'm very excited by them as an individual person, recognizing my own responsibilities and my own values. But at the end of the day, I have to see them as a way of serving our clients' needs, which is finding a way to look at the world through a sustainability lens that adds to our returns by improving long-term growth opportunities, by managing risks, and then clearly reporting and engaging around the issues of today to make sure they're not issues that exist in the future. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So our next speaker is Maya Korengel. Maya is Senior Partner and Financial Service Sector Lead at TPG's The Rise Fund. She also serves on several advisory boards, including the advisory board of the Harvard Business School's Social Enterprise Initiative. Over to you, Maya.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation for all of us, and also for the stewardship that CalPERS is taking in bringing these issues to light, which are very important to everyone on this side of the table. I'm going to try to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals in light of why it is that TPG raised the RISE Fund in the first place. And the basic rationale was that as a global society, we are facing many, many, many complicated problems and challenges in the world today. And if you look at some of these problems, 2.3 billion people in the world don't have access to a toilet. About half of the world's adults does not have access to a bank account or to financial services formally delivered. There are about 650 million people today who live on land that could be flooded by the end of the century. The last three were problems mostly associated with the developing world, but if you look at here in the US, 2/3 of American fourth graders can't read proficiently. So the problems that we're thinking about affect not only the developing world, but the developed world as well. And if you sum up all of the challenges that we're facing as a global society, many of which are enumerated on this page, and you think about the amount of financing or capital that's required to meet them, as Andrew mentioned, there's a $93 billion need. Approximately $4 to $5 billion, trillion dollars, I'm using billions, I should use trillions, $1 trillion a year needed to solve the problems and achieve the outcomes that are iterated in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Only 1.4 trillion is being met each year today, mostly by development aid, by philanthropy, and hence we need commercial capital to come into the picture and play a role in satisfying and achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this is one of the fundamental reasons why the RISE Fund was created, because we as a firm felt that there was an opportunity, again, as outlined by my peers here at the table, but also because it was the right thing to do to show that commercial capital can play a role when very thoughtfully and wisely applied to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So how is TPG doing this? Why did we create the RISE Fund, and how does TPG position itself in order to play its own part? So TPG is a $84+ billion private equity and asset management firm. We have several different lines of business in private credit, real estate, public equity, and infrastructure, but also in private equity, which is at the core and heart of what TPG does. And the RISE Fund, which was launched last year, sits within the private equity group. RISE is a $2 billion fund that was raised last year. It's the first global scaled private equity platform directing institutional capital with a fundamental view to protecting the fiduciary interests of our capital providers, but that measurably addresses and measurably responds to some of the biggest social and environmental challenges that exist in the world today. We have 4 core pillars of our work. One is that we look for complete returns, and by that we mean that we are looking to invest capital with the same financial return and the same fiduciary lens that we place with every dollar of private equity investment that we make, but also we look to achieve measurable social and environmental outcomes, holding ourselves to an incredibly high standard on the impact front in the same way that we hold ourselves to a very, very high standard in terms of generating financial return. We have a platform that leverages the experience of great investors at TPG with several other partners. We have a sector-based approach using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as our anchor for thinking about the outcomes that we want to achieve. And we have an evidence-based approach to delivering impact. So we're not just investing in education companies because all education is good. We're not just investing in healthcare companies because all healthcare is good. We actually want to know for the companies that we invest in, what is the nature of the good that is being created? Is there research and evidence that the products and services are actually achieving positive impact? And how do we characterize that, measure that, and manage towards that as part of our work? What we did within the creation of the RISE Fund was to look at all of the categories that TPG invests in its private equity portfolio and pull out those that we could align with the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have a large practice. We invest in industrial companies, in retail companies, in consumer companies, but we focused in on only those sectors that were very, very much linked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So here are the 7: education, renewable energy and energy access, financial services, food and agriculture, growth infrastructure, healthcare, and technology. So we basically said for the RISE Fund, we're going to focus on these 7 sectors of investment that are already sectors that TPG has had a lot of investment experience in around the world. And then we said we're going to, again, look for the same kind of financial returns that we expect in all of our private equity practice, which you see along the expected financial return axis. But on the other side, we wanted to find companies where there is evidence that the products and services delivered actually create positive social or environmental impact in the world. TPG has incorporated ESG, or what we call actually GES, because we believe that if you start with good governance, the E and the S will follow. But we have incorporated ESG into our investing practice for about a decade. So ESG previously existed, and we sort of rank it in that sort of passive approach to impact column, if you can look at it that way. But the RISE Fund takes impact one step further. We're intentionally sourcing companies that we have evidence create social or environmental good. So we're looking for businesses where there is collinearity between the financial returns or the business success of the company and the impact that it wants to generate. So every unit of product or service that the company produces with positive margins also produces a unit of positive impact that we want to see. So you can think about it as an education company that is reaching a child and enhancing the learning of that child. The more children that it can serve over time, the greater the impact that it will have, so long as the products and services are generating those positive learning outcomes. We use independent research to assess and quantify the impact. This is something new that a lot of the impact fund managers in the private equity space have wanted to do, but it's very expensive to actually look at a company and find research that has been produced generally by academics to know that the product or service that is being delivered generates positive impact. And we wanted to make sure that we were holding ourselves to the highest standard of the creation of social or environmental impact, because our belief is that companies that create that kind of value and that can deliver positive results over time and do so with a positive and strong fundamental business model will last over time and outperform other companies. So it was fundamental to our work, and again, it was something that a lot of impact firms wanted to do but couldn't really do as well because it was very difficult to make that investment. So this is something that we've contributed to this space, looking to link third-party data to our investment practice to measure impact and identify impact. In our work, we have effectively cataloged over 600 academic studies to match the kind of investing that we've been doing. These are studies generated by the World Health Organization or the JPAL lab at MIT or by the University of Chicago. So we are the first fund that has really, in a very deep way, linked the worlds of academia and the world of investing to generate evidence that good can be done through commercial business models. And we've also started to create a new methodology or new framework to measure impact, which basically establishes a language for how we measure impact. It applies a multi-sectoral approach using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It uses analytical rigor that is germane to our firm, and we have used some third parties to come in and effectively audit and look at the work that we're doing so that we can both establish with credibility the veracity and the rigor of our approach, but also create a format that we hope to share with other investors, other organizations in the market who want to link their practices to actual academic research and evidence that they are creating good, or that they're understanding what the nature is of social or environmental impact that they're creating. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, in our breakout section. So what have we done with the RISE Fund? One is we have tried to deliver on the promise of bringing commercial capital to the table alongside philanthropy and aid and government development financing to address our society's greatest challenges. We want to direct capital to more effectively deliver social and environmental impact by linking to research so that we know that we're applying capital to the most productive and the most impactful, if you will, interventions. And we also want to drive accountability for the impact that we wish to generate in the world by measuring our impact, by having third parties come in and validate our impact, and finally, by sharing the work that we're doing with others in the world around us who are also striving to apply capital in the most productive way to meet the challenges that we have to that we face together as a society. So I'll pause there and we'll go to panel.
Great, thank you all. So I have a few questions to ask. One is, could you talk about how the SDGs have been useful to your ESG integration efforts? Specifically, have the SDGs illuminated risks or opportunities that you might have overlooked otherwise?
Well, we just think of it as a, as a useful framework. So think about it just as, I mean, in many ways you could think about it as sort of a checklist, just to remind yourself, okay, here are the major themes with respect to sustainability, and you can think about these. There's a lot of things that aren't specifically addressed in the targets of the SDGs, so it's not to be all-encompassing, but we think it's pretty helpful, and especially helpful if you think about the trajectory of reporting, disclosure, and financial market disclosures in general. Once again, I remind people we're only 2 years into this, but think about where we'll be 5 years from now. I mean, these goals are being promoted, they're being adopted by companies in terms of reporting and disclosure. they are the key focus of governments and agencies and NGOs around the world for the next 12 years at least. So we think that's why it's important to sort of adopt the framework early and pay a lot of attention to it. I think you'll see a lot more of those disclosures coming from companies and people who access the capital markets. And for instance, you'll see, I mean, you've started to see it, but you'll see more of it. Companies issuing things like SDG bonds, for instance, in fixed income, where they actually say, here are the proceeds. We're going to attack this particular problem. Here's a business opportunity. We're going to use the capital this way. Or here's a risk we're going to address. We're going to improve the business by doing this with these proceeds, and then they're going to report annually on it. So we're big advocates of that. We think you'll see this big shift. Many people in here are probably familiar with green bonds. Green bonds, growth really is taking off every year. Those people raising money to address a particular, it tends to be with energy-related or environmental types of issues. But you could think about what's happened with green bonds as sort of just a subset of what's likely to happen with sustainability bonds or SDG bonds, right, that attack all these different sorts of problems. So that's sort of where we think things are headed over the next several years, and that's why the SDGs are sort of a useful framework. That's how I would describe it.
I think our first action was to ask ourselves, how did the SDGs differ from ESG? ESG's been around for quite some time. We've integrated it for over a decade. And that was where we focused on the future intention of the SDGs, whereas ESG typically has looked at existing processes and activities of businesses, so they're much more around risk models. The Sustainable Development Goals were about that first of my 4 pillars around recognizing new, exciting growth opportunities. So we've resisted sort of immediately relabeling our ESG as SDGs. I think that's quite important. Measurement and reporting of your impact and your progress towards achieving specific outcomes is really very important. It goes right to the heart of impact investing or SDG investing, because it is about that future change. And like TPG Rise, we've been spending a lot of time on our measurement and reporting frameworks, because we think that's about illustrating the progress. Where that's really helped us across the rest of the organization is to really recognize that much more forward-looking impetus that we want to get. We want to get the world changing. So how do you use this as a mechanism for change? And I think most importantly for us, that's been reflected in our stewardship business. So we have nearly 50 pension funds and institutions around the world who we do voting, engagement, and public policy advocacy. Many of the SDGs we have probably been doing for quite some time, like gender equality, diversity, etc. But we weren't labeling them as such. But it's given us a fresh impetus to think about those issues and challenges, those underserved or unmet needs in global society that we can engage with companies around, and we can actually build it into our engagement agenda. So it's not just about the growth opportunities that we find and managing the risk, but it's also that power of engagement to change behaviors, to deliver better outcomes. And so for us, it's the measurement and reporting has actually got the most attention internally of all the PMs right across public and private, and particularly in our stewardship arm.
Within the private equity asset class, across venture to private equity, the SDGs have mainly been used as an organizing framework and an organizing principle. And what most fund managers are doing today, the Rise Fund included, is talking about their work in reference to the SDGs so that we have a common language and a common platform, and I think, as my colleagues have mentioned, a call to action. When there's a goal that needs to be met, it is easier for us to think about how we collaborate with each other to meet those goals. Often, private equity firms are quite competitive with each other, but the SDGs give us a basis to collaborate not only as co-investors, but also to think about how do we work with government, how do we work with nonprofits to achieve a certain objective. One of the things that we're trying to do today as a collective group is to think about how to report and how to measure and how to aggregate all the data. As the RISE Fund, we may be doing a number of investments, making a number of investments in education where our companies are effectively contributing to meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but there are a number of other funds who are doing similar things. How do we collect all of the information about the work that we're doing and put it in a format that it can be communicated to society at large about how we're furthering the UN Sustainable Development Goals? That's work that's ongoing in the space. It hasn't been defined or understood yet. And right now, more of the work that is happening is around aligning the investing that all of us are doing to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, so that we have a map in a common language that all of us can show and speak to, and we have goals that all of us can try to work towards. But we're still, I guess, at a work in progress kind of mode in the industry in terms of applying the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to all of our work.
Thanks. And building on Maya's answer, can any of you speak to differences you see between how the SDGs should be approached from, for public versus private asset classes?
I can start if you like. So we've done it maybe the odd way around, in that we started with public markets and we're working back to private markets. One thing I'll just quickly pick on that Maya said is that I think the key word in this is collaboration. There is so much collaboration going on in this space. We're normally very competitive as an industry, but there's been a lot of open sourcing of this. The way we tackled it is we started off with our SDG taxonomy, so actually saying what do the SDGs represent, because they are complex, so it is very difficult to just distill them down at the high level to meaningful things in the investment market. So what we did, we took each SDG, broke it down into roughly the underlying 10 themes, it works out at, per SDG, then said in public markets, which ones are addressable in private markets, which ones are addressable by government or philanthropy or by engagement. Where they were addressable by public market, we then looked at the addressable market, its nature, its growth, and how to access it. And then we mapped that to investable themes that were more readily understood for our portfolio managers when actually deploying capital in public markets. And what we found from that, in public markets, around about 25% of the 169 targets were actually addressable in public markets. And then we reinforced that by active and collaborative corporate engagement to try and reinforce it.
Okay, well, thank you. So have you seen asset owners, perhaps clients similar to CalPERS, utilizing the SDGs? And if so, can you talk to us about how and why?
So I think the answer is yes, and there's a lot more happening outside the U.S. for a host of reasons so far than there is in the U.S., but some of the largest pension funds in the world outside the U.S. are definitely incorporating SDGs into their framework and analysis. And also, I'd mention, some of the biggest debt issuers, be it sovereigns as well as agencies in the world, are also going to incorporate SDGs. We know at least a dozen or so where that's in the works and planning stage at this moment. So, there's a host of reasons why it's happening a little bit faster outside the U.S., but it's pretty clear to us that is definitely the trend. I mentioned it a little bit before, but these individual country reports on how a country is contributing to solving some of these problems and contributing to reaching the targets of the goals. Each country is going to produce a report. So far, there's just 47 that are doing that this week at the UN, presenting their new country level reports, which will be, they'll update them annually. So that brings the list to over 100 countries. But obviously that still leaves close to 100 countries that haven't yet done that, but they will over the next couple of years. But that's part of the reason why I think it's happening a little bit faster outside the U.S. But once again, if you look, to those large pension funds and large global sovereign wealth funds outside the U.S., definitely moving towards SDGs.
I would just echo that number one, the Europeans are further ahead than the Americans on this. The other group, I think, that is looking at the taxonomy of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is intermediaries. So those who are sort of stewards of capital, Cambridge Associates and other firms like that have started to really adopt the framework of the UN SDGs, but mostly we find that it's still a mapping exercise. So it's not that funds are being evaluated on, what are you going to contribute in terms of achieving the no poverty goal, or what are you going to contribute in terms of achieving quality education for all. Rather, it's tell me what your investing practice is, how does it map to the UN SDGs, and does that map to our values and our mission and our principles as a steward of capital. So it's really right now more of a mapping exercise, we find, than anything else, but we expect that to develop over time.
I concur with that mapping exercise. Europe has been a leader in it, but it's also worth stepping back and looking at some of the challenges that those early adopters have had. And having talked to several very large pension schemes in Europe, even bigger than CalPERS, I think they are beginning to recognize that they got too prescriptive too early, and that's narrowed their opportunity set. So they're really beginning to struggle to find investable opportunities, and that pushes them back to actually doing that mapping exercise, because they have to demonstrate that they're sticking to their stated policy, and so they're struggling to find enough actual opportunities to implement the plan. So the one lesson maybe to learn is to keep it flexible and very much that context based, because if you go too prescriptive in this area, you might just narrow down actually what you can do and be very frustrated.
Thank you, that was helpful. So do you think there are areas within the SDGs that you think would make more or less sense for investors such as CalPERS to focus on, especially given what you just mentioned about maybe you could narrow it a little too much or be too prescriptive?
When you look at the list, I mean, it's difficult to say there's anything that should be excluded or necessarily prioritized. I mean, both, the list of 17, you just go down there, you see risk and opportunity in each of those. So I think it's sort of, it's a good question, but I think it's very difficult to say, here are the 3 of the 17 that are, where the big opportunity is as investors or where the big risk is. I mean, it's all over in these 17 areas. So I guess I would be reluctant to suggest that is a direction that people should be going, to try to narrow it down that way.
I think you have to remember you have to still be a good investor, and so therefore it's that balance between the opportunity and the price that you're paying for it. There's actually no point in pursuing a theme if it's already played out in the market and is yesterday's story, is not tomorrow. So you always have to be aware of that challenge. I think looking at the breadth of coverage gives you optimism that there are some really exciting emerging themes. We've done that work. We've identified where in our public market we think that it's most addressable. We're doing a similar exercise in private markets, and they are different because there's different opportunity sets. So there's that flexibility. And then those areas that you can't actually directly invest in doesn't mean you can't have an influence in. That's where your stewardship and your engagement program becomes paramount, because you can then deliver on SDGs by actually actively engaging with companies to change their behaviors and to deliver very specific outcomes. So there is potential to deliver right across the board, but it's different levers that you will have to pull to actually generate that changed outcome.
Yeah, perhaps I'll address that. I think saying something similar, but with a slightly different angle. each of the UN Sustainable Development Goals can be looked at with a commercial capital lens, with a philanthropic lens, and with a government aid or development lens. And the fine art is to use and work with individuals who have thought about where capital should be allocated and how. And so you think from the vantage point of CalPERS and the stewardship of the finances of a vast number of constituents where you are looking for commercial return. You need to think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals in terms of the opportunities for those kinds of commercial returns. And what I think all of us would agree is that if you look at some categories like healthcare or some aspects of education, you will probably find more opportunities than, let's say, in saving the ocean, where there are fewer ventures and fewer opportunities that commercial capital has gone into. So it's important as we think about the UN SDGs to remember that they are very wide, they are all-encompassing, they are able to be used and deployed thinking about applying philanthropic money, development money, or commercial money. But you have to be extremely thoughtful and practiced in understanding, where to go and where to take that capital. And there are other places like policy advocacy, et cetera. If we're not in a position to, put philanthropic capital to work, there are other places of engagement where we can make a difference and have some influence. Again, trying to achieve the UN SDGs, but when we're thinking about it from a commercial capital lens, you start to look at other factors like what's the size of the market, are there companies that we can invest in, what are the return profiles? The return profiles for infrastructure are generally lower than they are for technology companies, and all of those other dimensions start to come into play.
Great, thanks. So how might CalPERS look at the SDGs and related impact as a way to potentially decrease systemic risks to our portfolio?
Well, there's lots of ways. I mean, the traditional way that people have approached this is think about stranded assets, but think about the pace of technological change. Think about, when people talk about stranded assets, they talk about entire business models that fail because the assets of the company, traditional one is, oil in the ground. Wonderful, put a value on that. What's it worth 5 or 10 years from now? Maybe not much. But you can do that industry by industry, going through and thinking about those types of risks. What about companies that depend on cheap water for one reason or another, or depend on arable land that may not be arable 5 to 10 years from now, where that's really the business dependency when you pull back the cover. Think about those companies that maybe depend upon especially cheap labor that they may not be able to access at some point down the road for a host of reasons. And there's a lot of companies there, especially multinationals, that in one way or the other have really depended upon that. So there's a lot of ways to think about the systemic risk there. Another whole avenue is to think about cybersecurity and think about industries that are particularly exposed to those risks. There's a potential for entire industries and certainly companies within industries to really fail given cybersecurity threats in the future. So that's a whole other area to think about, how to reduce risk by really focusing on those companies, those industries maybe that are really preparing for those types of things. So I guess that's the line of thinking, but it's a very extensive list. But if you put on your thinking hat, it won't take long to identify all those types of risks and that could come in to harm your portfolio return if you're not really looking for the best in class in those areas.
I wouldn't really add very much to that, because I think that was a pretty comprehensive way of doing it. I think the debate often is around exclusion. Should you be just excluding things for a matter of ethics or principles? And I think we always have a problem with that, because it should be around identifying companies that you don't want to own, or industries or businesses, because their commercial model is going to fail. I think that's a much better way, as Scott has said, to actually come at the problem. Once you sort of just exclude something on principle, then you have the danger that you've lost control of the debate. And I think it's being actively involved in the debate is so important, that one's voice must be heard, both at the board level and at the public policy level. So I think that, for me, that's a very good way of actually ensuring that you avoid the worst of the losses by constantly engaging with the enterprises in which you invest.
Okay. All right. Well, last question. We've talked a lot about, impact relative or contributing relative to the SDGs, but how do you actually approach measuring that impact, at underwriting, during ownership, and at exit? And this question is particularly for Maya.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm one of the things I'm most pleased about, as I mentioned briefly when I talked about the RISE Fund, is the work that we have done to think about impact, to measure impact, both to identify whether a company has the kind of impact that would merit it being considered by the RISE Fund for investment, and also to establish goals that we expect the company to meet while we are invested in the company, and that we want to report on. So very often you'll see when fund managers make investments that they evaluate a company, they calibrate what is the revenue growth for the company going to look like over the next 5 years, how much profitability is it going to generate, how are its assets going to grow. We have very fine models that we build that look at financial and business performance over time, and we want to hold our managers of those companies accountable for results. What we've done with the RISE Fund is to build a framework and a tool that allows us to do the same, but for the impact side. And we do this as part of our evaluation, again, to determine whether a company is generating the kind of impact that we think meets the criteria of the RISE Fund, but also to help us identify and manage towards goals over a company's life. And perhaps the best way to give you a sense of this is to give an example of a company. So one of the companies that we looked at when we were building our methodology was a company that was building 100-bed hospitals in rural India. And we looked at the management's goals over time. They wanted to build several hundred hospitals from a base of 0 over time. And we took a look at the operations of a model hospital and said, based on the company's projections, how many customers will it serve over time? And obviously this notion of bringing healthcare to a rural environment where no formal medical care existed was a generally positive thing. But then we took it one step further and we said, how do we know, even though it made intuitive sense, how do we know that putting hospitals where none exist and delivering good quality care actually makes a difference? And this is where we went to academic research, and we looked at academics who did some studies in the country of Brazil and showed that over time, in rural communities where a hospital was built versus rural communities where there was no formal medical care, they actually could calibrate that life expectancy for the population, for the community that was being served, went up. Again, it makes intuitive sense. If you provide good health care in a community that doesn't have it, there will be positive health results, but what the academics actually zeroed in on was length of life. Now, how did we measure and think about how to manage towards this goal? So just in the same way that in a financial outlook, we might look at what is the revenue generating capability of these hospitals over time as you build more and more hospitals. Instead, we started to focus in on how many customers are you going to serve, what is the quality of that healthcare, and how can we prove that we're actually improving health outcomes in the community over time. And as you start to embed these metrics and these measurement characters, thinking about the outcomes and not just sort of top-line financial or our operating statistics, you start to care about the medical incidences that happen in that community, whether you're staffing it with the kind of doctors and the kind of interventions that are actually meeting a lot of need, that you're focusing in on what improves quality of life. And this is the nature of the work that the RISE Fund does with every investment that it makes. We look at a company, we look at what management says it's going to achieve over a time period. We link that to academic research and evidence, which gives us a sense of whether the product or service is actually achieving good. And then we can measure over time, once we're invested in the company, whether it's meeting those goals. It's a lot of work to do this. It sounds pretty straightforward in the example that I gave, but it is more intensive than you might imagine. We've had a lot of interest and excitement from the academic community, which always appreciates when its work is being incorporated into practice, and the fact that we can think about academic research and what achieves impact also allows us to work with management teams to implement programs that will increase the impact of the products or services that the company is delivering. And when we create value, through a successful business model, again, we feel that that value will be reflected in the business results, and we will create a long-standing, sustainable company over time. So again, this methodology allows us to identify whether a company is impactful and meets the criteria of the RISE Fund, but it also gives us tools to measure performance over time, to bring resources to the companies over time to manage their impact. And then when we sell the company and exit our investment, to look back and say, did we achieve what we meant to? Did we get something wrong? If we got something wrong, why did we get it wrong? What could we have done differently to maximize the impact of this company? And so that again is something new in terms of approach that hadn't been an approach or a methodology that had existed before the RISE Fund was launched and created. And again, this is something that we hope to share with others. We have an entity that we're calling RISE Labs that we will be launching as a service provider to help advance this work for other investors, for foundations, for governments, for corporations that want to have tangible, real, positive impact results with their work over time, and to help them to measure, to link to academic research, and to push and raise the bar on impact and on the delivery of impact.
I'm quite reassured hearing all that, because we're about a year behind the TPG RISE Fund, and we're doing a very similar thing. In public markets, though, just sort of slightly differently, our approach is that we split the impact achieved into two areas. One into what we call enterprise level impact, i.e. the impact that the company is delivering, so through its products and services, and then the investor-led impact, which is the impact that we have through the way that we're engaging with a company around about delivering change behaviors. And so we look to measure those. We use a series of IRIS indicators, which are a comprehensive set of indicators from the Global Impact Investing Network. Very much look at not just they're very focused on outputs. So, for example, if it's a tertiary education company in the developing world, it might be the number of pupils enrolled, the number of teachers hired. We actually then look at the outcomes for the beneficiaries, which is, have they seen an uplift in their post-educational salary? And there's a lot of evidence in the developing world that women get substantial uplifts in their salaries for going to tertiary education. Some parts of the world, it's secondary education or even primary education. And I think that splitting it down into what we can do and what the company can do is very important. We also then try increasingly to look at the negatives, and that I think is one of the harder things. What are the offsets? So, for example, we have an investment in a company that's been very successful in reducing vehicle emissions, and about 80% of its products are around fuel saving and emission savings. But we're now engaging with them to become a zero carbon business. So not just looking at their outputs, look at their inputs. So if you produce more CO2 to make these products than you save when they're put on vehicles, then there's not a lot of point to this. So it's a very complex business, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about what TPG do, because the sharing is very important, because we do want to create these norms about actually how we all go about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Those were, I guess those were all the prepared questions, so I'll give it back for
Thank you.
questions.
Are there members of the board who have questions? I definitely do. Well, I think this has been a really fascinating panel and really helped give me a lot of insight into how, on the ground, operationally, you're actually integrating the SDGs into how you do your work. I've heard a lot from sort of the alpha perspective, sort of how do you pick between companies and identify opportunities, investment opportunities. But from to me, as you know, CalPERS has a significant passive equity holding, and from a beta, in a way, it matters more to us what happens from a beta perspective. How does mitigating the SDGs collectively, how does that deliver more sustainable markets, sustainable economies, resilient markets, better economic growth over the long term? And I'm just curious how you all are thinking about it and integrating that into your investment briefs.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because that's why I talked about a 4-pillar approach and a context-based approach, because I think it's going to differ from organization to organization. So, for example, if you're a growth manager running mutual funds in Minneapolis, you might focus just on the growth element. For other managers, it might be about really just good disclosure. They do what they do, and they disclose what their impacts are. And I think when you're a passive investor, and we're seeing this in the commercial passive investors, they've suddenly discovered the joys of engagement. We would say it's about time, but there is, and you've been doing it for a long time already, you exemplify that element. So that's my third pillar around advocacy, not just at the corporate level, but also at the public policy. Scott, mentioned that in credit now, you actually probably have more leverage in credit in terms of engaging, particularly around ESG issues. Why? Because they're not raising money from my world in public markets, they're raising it from Scott's world in the credit markets. So you've got all these different levers to use, and it just depends on the context of your organization's needs and objectives, the resources. We aspire to touch all 4 pillars. We're working probably most on pillar 4, because that's probably where we're weakest on reporting. So that's why I think context is very important. It can't be a prescriptive approach. So it's seeing where you have the most leverage, and undoubtedly that engagement process in passive is a very, very important way forward.
I would just add on one thought here that if there's significant progress made on achieving these goals in the SDGs, it's going to be tremendously impactful to growth. And as an equity investor, as a passive equity investor, that's what you really want to see, is growth, and that's how you get the big benefit if you're passive. It's been estimated, for instance, just on one of the goals, gender equality, by 2025, if there was smooth and steady progress made towards the goal every year by 2025, the estimates are that global GDP would be 20 to 30% larger, by 2025 than it would be otherwise if we just have static progress. So that's just one goal. The estimates are all over the map, but basically if there's significant progress on all of them, growth will be much higher, and equity investors will get their fair share of that growth.
Thank you very much for that. Can I ask another question? Are there other board members who have a question? Lynn, did you? I'll let you go. Go ahead. I'll jump in after. Ms. Pigwin.
Thank you, Madam President. I was just curious, too, kind of building off of what Priya mentioned, too, with the fact that we're large-scale index passive investors. Maybe this is a better question for Beth. Do you see more of an opportunity in emerging markets to employ the SDGs?
Just looking at our public investments or overall?
Well, I was thinking overall, so where are
Overall.
the areas, if, in addition to focusing on the engagement approach within public equities, if we look at emerging market opportunities?
Right. So I think, and some of our panelists mentioned earlier, the SDGs seem to be a framework that is not just about developing economies. So I think we could look at it across our portfolio potentially. It does seem that there is a lot of opportunity for the majority of goals within the developing or emerging economies. As an investor, I think we'll have to be very thoughtful about how we approach these, such that we ensure that the approach is aligned with our goals and the factors we're focused on to achieve the returns within our global equity portfolio. So I would have to have Dan comment on that a little, Dan Bienvenu, further. But I would think that throughout our portfolio, there are ways across our real assets portfolio, across our fixed income as well, to look at ways to potentially invest around the SDGs. I wouldn't just see it as potentially for our global equity portfolio, and actually CalPERS has invested it in the RISE fund. So I think there are opportunities across our fund, but I think we'll have to be thoughtful about how much, I guess, we decide to focus our sustainable investment efforts on the SDGs. And so I think this conversation has been helpful in informing my thinking on that as well.
Thank you.
Was there a question over here, Ms. Taylor?
You can go first.
That's okay, go ahead.
So thank you very much. And Beth, thank you very much for the presentation. All of you, wonderful presentations. I'm just excited to see this presentation. So, but also, one of my questions was, in our mapping, the mapping that you presented, Beth, in the beginning, was really, really good. I noticed, my glasses have to adjust here, number 17 on partnerships. So I just wondered if, as the presentations were going on, I'm not sure I heard a lot of talk about partnerships, and if you guys were partnering with other managers, and whether or not we're partnering with other investors, especially around the, maybe around the climate. I think we're better on that because we already have the Climate 100, but maybe the S, I haven't seen a lot of that happening with the S. So if any of you, maybe start with Beth, and then move down. I was just wondering if that would work for us.
I think given the scope of the SDGs and the global nature, I think should CalPERS move forward related to our strategic plan to incorporate the SDGs, we would need to involve our partners.
Okay.
And I think there's already a lot of work being done, for instance, at the PRI, that would be possible for us to leverage as part of our effort. And this sort of, as I mentioned early on, when we went about mapping the SDGs, we tried to look for those high-level overlaps. And where we see them with our partnerships is very much organizations such as Ceres and PRI.
Okay.
That we would work through.
Yeah, just some thoughts there. I mean, I think, there's a number, you mentioned PRI, but there's a number of organizations that are really, doing, a lot more work every year. It just kind of accelerates, and so there's a lot of ways to partner. I think another one is the UN Global Compact, which is now, I think, about 9,000 signatories. Not that many asset managers yet, but that is a really powerful, important network, and so that's one to think about too if you haven't been involved in that. Which is, think about it as almost like the private sector initiative of the UN to bring in private investors. So that's its whole focus, and that's what that organization is built around. So that's one I would mention is pretty important.
Yeah, no, I'd agree on the collaboration is the word I used earlier. The conversations that I've had nowadays are multiple and across all segments. So I talk to social entrepreneurs, NGOs, get involved with government initiatives, fellow investors, because we're all very open and collaborative. And I think because it's a system-wide change we need, that collaboration, that partnership is very important. I co-chair the UNEP FI Positive Impact Initiative. We're trying to create a collective norm and a framework for impact investing, and recognize that impact is achieved across the whole of the economic spectrum, and we need to think about it in a more broad sense rather than a narrow sense. That's a very welcome CalPERS joining me on that. But there's things like the impact management project. Governments in Europe are beginning to look around social impact. You have the EU directive on sustainability. And also, I think the advocacy and the work that you do in that area is very important. And beyond climate, I think it's very important as well to get better disclosure from companies and to get a move towards a mandatory reporting framework. Because without a mandatory reporting framework, we won't have commonality. So even around carbon disclosure, the numbers are all over the place. Mm-hmm. And if they're discretionary, what happens is the very biggest companies do it, the smallest ones don't, and the ones in the emerging world don't do it at all. So I think, we need to keep lobbying people like SASB, encourage the work that they're doing. So it is just think of it in that system change, everything that we can do and, to advocate for a more sustainable system. I think I'm all for it. And today's a good example of it.
I think, I echo what everyone has said around the table, and I would say that, CalPERS has always been known to strike fear in the hearts of the managers, because you're very exacting and you have very high standards with respect to performance, and I think the same should hold true for the impact side, and not just in terms of financial return. So I think the engagement is important, and the way we think about it within TPG Rise, and it's been echoed by some of what we've tried to create, is to hold ourselves to the same high standard around identifying, measuring, and managing towards impact that we do in all other elements of our business. And one of the areas of partnership with CalPERS that I'll highlight is that we created a new council, if you will, for the RISE Fund, which CalPERS sits on, that looks at the methodology that we use in our impact measurement, in our impact management, and in our impact reporting process, with a hope that we will be challenged by CalPERS and others on that council, but also that we will use that as a forum to share the work that we're doing, so that as more funds come to the market offering an impact product, that a very high standard be met. And the worst thing that can happen, we think about in our space, is that we get accused of greenwashing, that this is all just a marketing tool. We are here at the table, and we've incorporated this into our work because we believe that it needs to be done in order to help make the world a better place for future generations. And we need to be very rigorous about that, and we need to defend that, and we need to make sure that others who are coming to the table, because the impact vocabulary is still being formed and is very all-encompassing, we need to hold everyone to a high standard of integrity of work. And I think that's something in your thinking as you go forward that we would love for you to bring to the table. Hold us accountable to do good work on this front, just as you do in every other aspect of our business with you.
All right, thank you. So I also, just real quick, you talked about using your, I guess you have your own measurements, right, to quantify and hold yourselves accountable to this. Is this something you're sharing? As talking about, working collaboratively, I'd like to make sure that we
are.
Yeah. So as the RISE Fund, we are. There's a staging of our sharing of the effort, because we've been building it over the course of the last 2 years, and CalPERS, along with the other investors in our fund, are among the first to see the work. But we have created a separate entity called RISE Labs, which is a public benefit corporation, led by a woman named Marianne Hancock, who is a remarkable leader, who will be taking our methodology and improving it, as well as offering it to others to use, because we have been able and lucky enough to make a considerable investment in doing this work that aspirationally a lot of our peers have wanted to do but haven't been able to make that same investment. And I think, maybe you can talk about the impact management project, but there are some other initiatives too.
Yes, and the impact management project is our way of sharing our measurement methodology. We've been working with them for a year. There's 700 different organizations. It's all open source. People are sharing their taxonomies, their measurement approaches. You know, some of my meetings in San Francisco tomorrow are going to be about that. Our SDG taxonomy for how we identify our emerging themes, we're going to make that open source. That's going to be published on our website. It's going to be interactive. And the UNEP FI Positive Impact Initiative is all about open source and working collaboratively together. So it's about sharing and learning collectively.
Well, let's hope we get a standardized metrics, because that, I think, is our big, hampering point when we come to this. So hopefully with all of this research and work that you guys are doing, I'd love to have it become a standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's very informative and insightful. I really was listening to your comments when you said that we possibly could be too prescriptive in identifying these 17 goals, and I appreciate that comment. And I was wondering, though, if we had earlier this morning talking about technology, and we have been discussing our investments in technology and a lot in health-ish areas. And if we are going to target those areas, does the framework provide for, once we identify those areas from an economic point of view, and just as you talked about the targeted outputs, and for example, in technology, several billion people don't have access to checking account. Aren't we going to eventually map that to achieve those goals anyway? So we should be focusing on the front end of the economics and the outputs and identifying, as you've done with your model, and then which of those 17 areas that it'll have an impact on, and then identify them, and then measure that. What are your comments in that regard?
Yeah, I think that is in the way that you framed it, it is the approach that some have taken. I think the challenge that we're facing as a collective group is the standardization of how we collect that information and express it in terms of achievement of the end goal. So most folks are looking at it exactly as you have, which is to say, here's an opportunity. These are the outputs that are delivered by the business, and at the end of the day, we can figure out how those contribute to the outcomes that we all want to achieve. So it is absolutely an accurate framing of the approach that some managers are taking. And what we are all working on collectively as an industry is, how do we standardize the units of output? How do we call them apples to apples, and how do we aggregate them so that we know we're meeting those goals? And it's actually the United Nations and a few other bodies like the World Economic Forum that are trying to do that translation across the chain. So today, as we do our work at the RISE Fund, there isn't an external body that has come to us and said, okay, what are you delivering in terms of achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Right now, it's all self-reported, and it's all, again, we have a few external firms like KPMG that are effectively attesting to our results or auditing our results, but I'm not adding that to, Andrew's investments and their results, or Scott's, and looking at it holistically and saying, are we meeting the UN SDGs? But we're trying to figure out that piece of the puzzle. So we actually live more, I think, in the world right now that you've articulated in terms of approach.
Good, and the measurement is a very important element. And Scott, I think it was your presentation that showed that you were measuring and you evaluated, and you have a scale of 5. I think that was part of your presentation somewhere back in here. So how does your 5 match your 5 over here or another company's 5? So we still got the problem. I mean, you focus just on your data. So how do you compare that to the industry-wide evaluation? Because that's your data that you're saying it's a 5. So how do you
it's a good
quantify
question.
that?
It's a good question. I think, eventually there will be more widely accepted, standardization in terms of, you think about traditional credit scores or maybe even traditional equity scores on some metrics that you can find. I mean, there's some general agreement. The exact and who's in the top quartile and exactly maybe who's in the bottom quartile. There's some general agreement there. There might be some small differences, but I think that's the direction that everyone's going. There will be a standardization of disclosure and data, and just like there has been with traditional credit metrics, let's say in fixed income, there's Moody's and there's S&P and then there's several other data providers. In general, Moody's and S&P have the same credit rating, not always, but in general they do. So we sort of see it developing as there's more data disclosure in that direction. Now, until we get there, there's a lot of dependence on individuals to do their own work for consistency. But, we certainly are part of, every other organization collaboratively that we can be to sort of get some consensus around, how do we develop that better framework for scoring. And I think that what you'll see is, there's many people, all of us as well as others in the industry working to develop that. And there's also, entire businesses being built around that idea now. So MSCI, for instance, has done a lot of work there and has a pretty extensive database of research with respect to sustainability issues. And I think you'll see several other companies that are, as a business, looking to develop those standards. So it's happening. It's just going to take some time. Until that happens, I think it means that a lot more people have to do a lot more homework themselves. To do something that, and we have to all get comfortable sort of speaking different languages a little bit. Equity investors have a certain language, fixed income investors have a certain language. We're not going to be in a world where English is the common language in this space anytime soon, to put it in those terms.
Yeah, because, you make reference to Moody's Standards and Poor's. We all know what their criteria is, and so you feed data in, and your output is a true evaluation comparative to others. Yeah. So when we get to that point, I guess it would be more valuable. But right now, it's,
Could I just make a controversial point on that?
Yeah.
Because I'm have slightly different views. In that I think we need a standardization of how we identify impact and how the framework for looking at it. In thinking that a data score, a universal data score, is the solution, brings some hidden dangers. And I think Scott was right saying that we have to work hard at this. And we have to work hard as well to differentiate ourselves from each other. That's quite important. The danger, and I'm already beginning to see this, as people already are trying to push for a standardization of impact data before there's any standardization of corporate reporting on it. What happens then is instead of playing to the highest common denominator, they play to the lowest, and they get obsessed about the methodology. And then the methodology drives the development of the product, and that's just product that we sell to people with an impact label on it. Whereas I think impact is a very sort of rich tradition. It grew out of philanthropy, out of social entrepreneurs, foundations, and so it shouldn't suddenly become an index product. Because then the problem with that is that people are using the methodology to create an index rather than actually change future outcomes. And so that's where I think there are some sort of hidden dangers, and that's one of the challenges in Europe that we have. We have the EU directive that we should integrate into our pension system, sustainability. I agree with that. But then the EU, as a body, wants to create a taxonomy themselves to tell us what good investing looks like. And I find that a little bit terrifying. And all it will do is actually play that into the hands of passive investors who aren't actually changing the world. So I think we all should have to work that little bit hard to justify to you what we're doing in terms of being impactful investors and what that means. We all need our own personal impact narrative.
And I agree with everything you said there. I think it's important, and I always stress this because there's a lot of gray areas. There always is in investing, and in terms of just differences of opinion, that's what makes markets about what the best risk-return trade-off is. But with respect to sustainability, I always make the point, I don't think people should make the mistake, and I see it happening a lot, of letting perfection be the enemy of the good. And it's always quite clear in my mind that, you know, any particular issue, people may have different rankings, what company's doing it well, who's doing it better than the next one, and there's a lot of debate about what's the right data set, and I have a better process, and no, mine's better. But in general, if people just follow the concept that, well, you know, there's different paths, and one might be better than the other, but it's important to get on a path. You know, don't forget the goal. And if people do that, I think they'll get better investment returns. I think that's what will make a bigger difference. But, you know, if people, you know, sometimes I think people kind of resign themselves. So they say it's just too complex, too hard to deal with right now. And so it's easier to sit back and try to hope somebody solves it. But I think that's probably not the right approach, because I think most people can agree on general what the right direction is, in general what makes sense. Common sense and analysis just goes a long way in this, you know, in this sort of framework. So we always encourage people to just, you know, get beyond that point of there's not going to be a perfect answer. So if you just have that mindset of not letting it get in the way of doing sensible things, then that's how you can really make a difference.
I would just add to that, if I may, that Bob Eccles and a few others have done some more work mapping the SDGs to the SASB standards, which could be a useful tool moving forward. And then also Pierre, the Principles for Responsible Investment, is developing a SDG questionnaire for investors, which is sort of the first step towards perhaps ultimately becoming part of the reporting and assessment, which we can then use to maybe assess not only our own performance, but our collective performance. But that's a few years down the line, probably. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time. Are there any other questions from board members? I have just one more, and that's around structural impediments, and particularly in the sort of the alignment and relationship between asset owners and investment managers that might impede our ability to actually achieve the kind of impact that we want. And you know, I'm thinking specifically of fund structures that have are time limited and maybe prohibit or inhibit your ability to really look out beyond 5 or 7 years as terms of capturing the value that's created by the activity that you're engaging in or the company that you're investing in. And how are you managing that within your relationships with your clients and looking at that in the future?
Maybe I can start with a couple of things. So there is a lot of creative thinking that the impact investing fund managers are trying to bring to the table because we have identified a number of issues that are challenging in our work. I will say that the challenge, especially to those of us who are aspiring to market rate returns, which again not everyone is in the spectrum of impact investing, is if you believe you can achieve market returns, you should fashion yourselves and execute your work using the same features as any mainstream product. So this is sort of the tug and pull. But a couple of things to highlight. One is that some of the work that needs to be done in this space is to seed earlier stage companies where there are fewer proof points in terms of successful business models, to be a little bit more disruptive and innovative about the work. And in many cases, especially in the emerging markets, less so in the United States, having a longer time frame to prove out a business model would help. So ideas like having longer dated funds than your usual 10+2 structure in private equity has been one that's been put about. Having an evergreen fund structure, which gives for a little bit more flexibility in terms of timelines to let companies ride out, are some of the thoughts that have gone about. But again, the challenge is finding investors who are willing to take that risk, especially when there isn't a lot of track record. A second, which is a more concerted effort that some of us have brought to the table, is pairing different kinds of capital to solve a problem. So you look at an investment opportunity, and there are some funders like foundations who are really, really interested in the impact aren't as sensitive in terms of financial return and who are willing to pair themselves with more market return-oriented investors so that you have what I'll call a blended finance or a hybrid structure to invest in a deal. So you have an investor who's actually willing to take losses and risk their capital to absorb losses so that more mainstream commercial forms of capital which need a market return can come in and play. Often this work has been done on an investment by investment basis, but one thought is whether you can create a fund itself that has impact objectives, that sources capital from capital providers who are not driven to generate market return because they have different sources of money than pensioners, for example, that can be paired with market rate funds in unleashing and funding more companies. So blended finance is a very, very big topic and of interest in the impact world, recognizing that sometimes you need more flexible approaches to return, and if you bring different types of capital providers to the table, you could actually fund a number of, a larger number of companies that are really intending to deliver social or environmental good than are being addressed today.
I see sort of two challenges. One is just Maya's just effectively touched on is the ability to get scale-up capital in. If you think about the SDGs and if you look at where the geographic burden falls, it's largely on Africa, about half of the SDG commitments required for Africa. And there you have an institutional problem, very high levels of interest rates. You have weak institutional ownership structures and some very high risks around fraud, business models, but also currencies. So that's a challenge, particularly in the private space where you have no easy mechanism for mitigating those. I do see it as a worry and a challenge in my more public market space is that the whole area gets just expropriated by linear transformation of low quality ESG, just gets relabeled as SDG. I'll give you an example of that. The tobacco company, British American Tobacco, claimed to touch all 17 SDGs. Obviously, they meant negatively. But that is the danger, is there's an awful lot of companies who recognize that by publishing SDG commentary, that they can get a higher rating. So there is, I think, as the end investor on behalf of your beneficiaries, it's important to identify the authentic from just the convenient marketing. And for me, the work that you mentioned, Bob Eccles, I was actually talking to him this morning about one of his papers, and even in ESG space, none of these things map because they're not audited. They're all in the back section of the report and account, so they're sort of discretionary and can be interpreted by the company, so that we need to move those items from the back of the report and accounts to the front of the report and accounts. It's only 20 odd years ago that we didn't have a cash flow statement, so we need a sustainability statement, and maybe starting with Bob's idea of a materiality statement, a purpose statement, is a really good way for companies to themselves to identify their positive and negative impacts. We shouldn't think of this just as a financial problem. It's a total system problem.
And just a couple thoughts there. I think the best improvement that investors can get by focusing on sustainability issues, the improved information ratio, if you will, is by focusing on the medium term. I mean, all of these things. That's how you really improve your investment results. You improve your return per unit of risk by really examining these topics through the lens of a medium to long-term time horizon. And so there's a natural conflict there. The markets are very short-term oriented. Most corporate management's very short-term oriented. I mean, how long are they in their seats? Not more than 5 years, usually at the executive level. So we have a bit of a market structure problem, but I mean, that's an opportunity too, because real long-term investors who are focused on that medium and long term can take advantage to some extent of the fact that the average market participant, maybe even the average company, is too short-term oriented. So by, and that's another reason why we didn't talk about this. This framework is very helpful because it naturally pushes your time horizon for investment, causes you to focus on the medium and longer term. So that's another reason why we think it's going to be rewarding from an investment perspective in terms of improving risk-adjusted returns, because it forces you to do something that's a little bit, it's not human nature. I mean, it's human nature to overemphasize the short term and to act in a short-term fashion. But we know as investors that's not the right thing to do.
Thank you. Beth, any final comments before we wrap this session up?
No, just to say thank you to the panelists and everyone for their questions. This was a really informative discussion, and we appreciate you coming.
Yes, thanks so much for your insight and expertise. So we are going to take and Beth, I want to thank you and your team too for pulling this together. This is a lot of work, I know. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break now, and we'll be back by 3:45.